You might not give it much thought as you walk down a rainy street with your umbrella in hand. But if you were strolling the cobbled alleys of 18th century Paris, things would feel very different. The act of holding an umbrella, or worse, using one in public was, at one point, not just odd, it was controversial, it was feared, it was ridiculed, and it hinted at a subtle but deeply ingrained conflict of identity, class, and belief in the city of light. To understand why Parisians once scorned umbrellas, we must first remember that Paris, in the 1700s, was not quite the picture-perfect postcard city of romance we often imagine today. No, it was grimier, and far more chaotic. Open sewers still ran through certain quarters, horses pulled carts and carriages through narrow streets, kicking up filth and muck as they went. Rain did not fall romantically, it pelted down on wigged heads and powdered faces, turning the already sludgy pathways into rivulets of thick brown water. And yet, no one carried an umbrella, at least, not willingly. There were umbrellas, of course, known then as parapluies, literally against the rain. They had existed in some form in Europe since the 17th century, but their adoption was slow, hesitant, and deeply politicized. While umbrellas had long been used in other parts of the world, particularly in China, India, and the Ottoman Empire, their journey into everyday European life was more turbulent, and in France, especially in Paris, they were met with suspicion, and even hostility. The umbrella, you see, was associated with women, aristocrats, or Eastern foppery. It was an object of vanity, not practicality. Carrying one suggested that you were unwilling to endure the discomfort of nature, a luxury that belonged only to the pampered or the pretentious. Among working-class Parisians, getting wet was simply part of life. To cover oneself with a delicate fabric contraption during a downpour was to announce that you did not share their reality, and there was more. Cultural observers in the 18th century noted a strange paradox among Parisians. They disliked being wet, yet they refused to use umbrellas. Instead, they sought shelter under building awnings or trees, crowding like pigeons and waiting for the rain to pass. Men would wrap their cloaks more tightly around them, cursing the weather, but they would not, under any circumstances, open an umbrella in public. It was quite literally beneath their dignity. The ridicule was especially harsh toward those who dared to be early adopters. Many were laughed at in the streets, jeered by coach drivers, and mocked in salons and cafes. The umbrella had not yet shed its stigma. It was a novelty, an affectation, a thing for eccentrics or dandies. In fact, for many decades, the only Parisians brave enough to carry umbrellas were a small group of physicians and philosophers who, perhaps, were used to being at odds with the crowd. A major factor in this societal fear was the carriage industry. In the mid-1700s, coach drivers ran a highly profitable business, offering shelter from the rain in their covered carriages. If people began using umbrellas, they might no longer pay for rides during bad weather. In response, some drivers actively harassed pedestrians who carried umbrellas. According to accounts from the period, certain coachmen would intentionally splash or block individuals with umbrellas, treating them as threats to their trade. The class angle was inescapable. An umbrella made a statement. It said you could afford not only the device itself, but the privilege of staying dry without paying a fare. And as more upper-middle-class citizens took to using umbrellas, the object began to symbolize a quiet revolt, a way to assert one's independence in a society where transportation was often controlled by the elite. Oddly enough, it was not the nobility who normalized the umbrella. The aristocracy had their carriages and servants to protect them from rain. No, it was the rising bourgeoisie, the doctors, the lawyers, the thinkers, who began to turn the tide. One particularly influential figure was a man named Jean Marius, a Parisian craftsman who revolutionized the umbrella design in the early 18th century. Prior to Marius, most umbrellas were cumbersome, large, and difficult to manage. Marius created a lightweight, collapsible version that could be carried easily and opened with one hand as a practical tool rather than a fashion item. His version won the royal privilege, a kind of patent, in 1710, and he marketed it as an essential for ladies of taste. But even with this improvement, adoption remained slow. Public perception was hard to shift, so what was it that finally began to erode the fear of umbrellas? It wasn't convenient. It wasn't even clever marketing, it was persistence. More and more travelers, especially from Britain, began appearing on the streets of Paris with umbrellas. Unlike the Parisians, the English had embraced the device with more enthusiasm. In London, Jonas Huntway, a traveler and philanthropist, famously carried an umbrella for 30 years in defiance of ridicule, until he helped turn public opinion in his favor. The British didn't fear the umbrella. They wore it like a badge of honor. As Parisian society slowly grew more cosmopolitan and self-aware, attitudes began to shift, but not all at once. For years, the umbrella existed in a kind of social purgatory. It wasn't banned, it wasn't praised, it was suspicious. To carry one was to walk a strange line between dignity and absurdity. Those who used them were still eyed with amusement. Was it a sign of intelligence or foolish vanity? Was the person beneath the umbrella trying to say something? And if so, what? That is the curious heart of this story. For centuries, tools that served basic needs, shelter, protection, warmth, were never just tools. They were declarations. They divided classes. They created stereotypes. They challenged norms. And in rainy 18th century Paris, a simple umbrella could say more about you than your clothes, your speech, or your profession. But who were the early adopters? What types of people risked ridicule and abuse just to carry an umbrella? And how did the perception of this object evolve so dramatically in just a few decades? The umbrella rebels. You might think that the quiet act of opening an umbrella in a rainstorm would be met with appreciation or even envy. But in the streets of 18th century Paris, such a gesture often drew scorn. The resistance to umbrellas was more than just a curious quirk. It was rooted in class tension, deep tradition, and the stubborn pride of a society slow to embrace change. And yet, some did defy the norms. These were not revolutionaries in the traditional sense. They did not march or riot. They didn't even speak out in great manifestos. Instead, they strolled umbrellas in hand through muddy alleyways and crowded boulevards, enduring insults and ridicule with quiet persistence. These men and women became, unintentionally, the umbrella rebels of Paris. One of the earliest and most prominent figures in this unlikely movement was a physician named Dr. Jacques Barboux-Dubourg, an Enlightenment thinker, translator, and amateur meteorologist. Dr. Dubourg was fascinated by atmospheric conditions. He recorded weather patterns, theorized about barometric pressure, and believed that preventative health began with understanding one's environment. He was also one of the few respected public figures in Paris to use an umbrella regularly. The decision was not born of fashion or vanity but of reason. He often said that catching a cold from getting drenched was not a sign of masculine toughness, but of poor judgment. Still, when he appeared with his umbrella on rainy days, especially near his clinic in Rue Saint-Honore, locals would sometimes boo him or call him Angler. Englishman is a term used pejoratively to mock those who embraced foreign ideas. To understand the sting of this insult, it's important to remember the deep national pride and rivalry between France and England at the time. The 7 Years' War had only recently ended, and Napoleon's rise was still decades away. Tensions remained high. The umbrella had, in the minds of many, become a symbol of English affectation. To carry one in Paris was to flirt with foreignness, to be modern, to be, perhaps, unfringed. Despite this, more Parisians began to follow Dubourg's lead, albeit quietly. Writers, philosophers, and tradesmen who had traveled to London often returned with umbrellas tucked under their arms, both literally and metaphorically. They had seen the practicality of the device, especially in a city like Paris, where weather was unpredictable and streets were treacherous when wet. Still, the class friction remained strong. In particular, coach drivers felt their livelihoods were under threat. Imagine this: a sudden downpour begins. In the past, pedestrians would flock to carriages to avoid the rain, paying a few sous for the luxury of a covered ride. But now, those with umbrellas could walk on. They were no longer captive to the weather. This to the coachman was not just annoying, it was dangerous to their business. Some drivers, it was said, made it their mission to sabotage umbrella users. Stories circulated, some exaggerated, some possibly true, of carriages intentionally swerving close to the curb to splash muddy water on umbrella-carrying pedestrians. Others claimed drivers would shout insults or demand payments from those they saw using umbrellas, accusing them of stealing customers. Newspaper caricatures from the period show umbrella users as pompous fools, hunched and awkward under their awkward contraptions. One particularly popular print depicted a man tangled in his own umbrella, soaked and miserable, while a carriage passed smugly by in the background. But as with many technological shifts, mockery gave way, slowly, to grudging acceptance. The rise of umbrella rentals. Around the 1760s, a subtle but important innovation appeared. Umbrella rental services. Certain cafes and barbershops in Paris began to offer umbrellas for short-term use. For a small deposit, you could borrow one, use it to shield yourself from the rain, and return it later. These businesses catered mostly to the emerging middle-class clerks, small merchants, tutors who couldn't afford personal carriages, but still wished to arrive somewhere dry. This marked a significant cultural turn. Renting an umbrella separated the object from the person. It became a shared tool rather than a personal statement. For many Parisians, this made the idea more acceptable. Another critical change came from fashion. The influence of the female umbrella. Women had a more complex relationship with umbrellas. For them, umbrellas or parapluies were closely linked to parasols, which had long been used for sun protection. Parasols were elegant, delicate, and deeply embedded in feminine fashion, but using the same item in the rain, that was something else entirely. The shift began in elite circles. Wealthy women began commissioning umbrellas with silk canopies, ivory handles, and intricate embroidery. These umbrellas were not just tools, they were accessories. By the late 1700s, umbrella makers in Paris were offering bespoke designs. If you had the means, you could have your initials engraved or even have one made to match your dress. Still, not everyone welcomed this new style. Older women, especially those raised in the strict traditions of the Ancien regime, considered rain umbrellas improper, too masculine, too foreign. Others worried about modesty, as umbrellas could draw attention to a woman walking alone, and some conservative men considered it unladylike for a woman to carry anything so large or practical. But fashion is a persistent force. Over time, the elegance of women's umbrellas helped soften their public image. What was once strange became stylish. The umbrella in literature and letters. Evidence of this changing perception can be found in the literature of the day. By the 1770s, references to umbrellas appeared in personal letters and satirical pamphlets. Writers like Voltaire and Diderot, though not deeply focused on umbrellas themselves, made passing comments on the absurdity of resisting useful tools out of pride or tradition. In one letter, a Parisian bookseller complains about how the youth walk now with heads held high, even in rain, under these little cloth tents, dry, proud, and ridiculous. Another author describes a gentleman who loved his umbrella more than his mistress, suggesting a growing affection, even obsession, with the device. Still, for many, the umbrella remained more than a tool. It was a social marker that required careful navigation. If you carried an umbrella, how you carried it mattered. Too high, and you seemed arrogant. Too low, and you risked poking others or appearing clumsy. Opening an umbrella indoors was widely frowned upon, not just for superstitious reasons, but because it symbolized bad manners. Etiquette manuals began to address umbrella usage directly, offering guidance on how to walk with one, how to collapse it gracefully, and how to place it near your seat without dripping on others. A drip of modernity. By the time the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the umbrella had begun to take its place in everyday Parisian life. The violence and upheaval of the revolution would drown out most trivial matters, but not entirely. Umbrellas appeared in paintings of the storming of the Bastille. Revolutionary pamphlets satirized royalists huddling beneath umbrellas while the people braved the rain. And yet, the umbrella's journey was not over. It would take another half-century before the object shed its complex associations entirely and became, at last, an ordinary possession. In fact, the umbrella's full integration into Parisian life is arguably a tale of the 19th century, when mass production, urban planning, and new ideas about hygiene turned the object into an essential rather than an eccentricity. Still, one must ask, what was it about this simple tool, a cloth stretched over ribs, mounted on a stick, that made it so threatening to a society? Was it simply new? Was it because it disrupted an industry? Or did it represent something deeper, a challenge to the idea that some discomforts were part of life, and that trying to avoid them was, somehow, dishonorable? How the umbrella won Paris. By the end of the 18th century, the streets of Paris had begun to change. The slow, almost stubborn resistance to umbrellas was softening. People still grumbled. Coach drivers still gritted their teeth, but the image of the lone umbrella carrier, once mocked, shamed, and sometimes splashed deliberately by passing carts, was becoming a familiar part of the rainy CITISCAPE. To understand how the umbrella finally won over Paris, we must look beyond fashion, beyond class resentment, and even beyond the simple desire to stay dry. The story of the umbrella's acceptance is, at its core, the story of modern urban living, and it begins unexpectedly with the weather. The Parisian climate problem. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, Paris faced a very specific set of urban challenges: crowded streets, unpredictable weather, and increasingly busy public life. While the city did not receive the downpours of a tropical climate, its weather was famously fickle: clear skies one hour, a soaking drizzle the next. These rapid shifts made city life difficult, especially in the expanding business and administrative sectors. People now needed to move between places of work, courtrooms, shops, cafes, and salons without the luxury of waiting out a storm. For much of the 1700s, the only protection from rain was a building's awning, a carriage ride, or a sturdy cloak. But as the pace of city life increased, the idea of standing still in the rain became less appealing. People needed movement, and the umbrella, though still viewed by some with suspicion, offered precisely that: mobility. This shift in mindset, mobility over tradition, was not exclusive to umbrellas. It reflected the broader changes happening across French society, especially in urban centers like Paris. The Enlightenment had planted ideas of rationality and utility into public thought. Why suffer needlessly in the rain, people began to ask, simply to uphold outdated pride? Public opinion slowly tilted. The 1790s and early 1800s saw a quiet but consistent change in public behavior. The umbrella had not yet become ubiquitous, but it was no longer a strange sight. Its earlier associations with Englishness, femininity, or pretentiousness began to fade as more working-class individuals adopted it, especially after the French Revolution, when old-class symbols were being reshaped, redefined, or abandoned altogether. Interestingly, a number of returning soldiers from the Napoleonic Wars are said to have brought umbrellas back from England, where they had been stationed or passed through. Unlike the dandies or doctors of earlier decades, these men had no interest in fashion. Their endorsement was practical. They had seen the utility firsthand in London and now adopted the umbrella as simply another tool, a better version of a cloak. It's no coincidence that the umbrella's popularity surged during a time when carriage usage was dropping. The post-revolutionary period saw a disruption in aristocratic wealth and services. Fewer nobles meant fewer carriages for hire. The once dominant coach drivers were now struggling to find consistent business, and their monopoly on rainy transportation was finally broken. With this decline, the aggressive anti-umbrella campaign waged by the coachmen gradually dissolved. Still, symbolic resistance lingered. One 1803 journal entry from a Parisian schoolmaster recounts how, during a morning storm, students were denied entry to a bakery on Rue Saint-Denis, not because they were wet, but because the baker disliked umbrellas on principle. He considered them arrogant and unnecessary. The students left confused but dry. These little moments of social tension reflected how deeply the umbrella had been tied not just to class, but to identity. For some, rejecting the umbrella remained a statement of toughness, tradition, or even nationalism. But such stubbornness was increasingly out of step with the times. Enter the industrial age. The real turning point came not from a single event, but from a broader economic transformation, the rise of mass production. In the early 19th century, French manufacturers began producing umbrellas on a larger scale, using cheaper materials and improved mechanisms. Whalebone ribs were gradually replaced by metal. Handles, once carved from ivory or hardwood, were now made from lighter, affordable composite. Waterproofing techniques improved. Umbrellas were no longer delicate luxuries or expensive accessories. They became reliable, repeatable, and crucially, affordable. This meant that for the first time, the umbrella became accessible to the average Parisian. Vendors began selling umbrellas in marketplaces and along bridges. Second-hand models were common. Street children, once hired to clean boots, now occasionally rented or sold umbrellas to passers-by. The object was no longer elite, it was everyday. Around this time, another curious development helped speed the umbrella's acceptance: uniformity. As umbrellas became standardized in appearance, simple black canopies with curved wooden handles stopped being personal statements and started to resemble tools. The anonymity of the umbrella helped strip away its stigma. It became an object, not an opinion. By the 1830s, it was no longer uncommon to see a busy Paris boulevard dotted with umbrellas during a rainstorm. They had become part of the urban fabric, so much so that umbrella etiquette guides were now being published. These guides instructed citizens on how far to hold your umbrella to the side when passing others, how to avoid dripping water on a neighbor's hat or coat, and kafio to carry a closed umbrella indoors or place it in an entry racand. Most curiously, how to share an umbrella with someone of the opposite sex without impropriety. What had once been controversial was now codified, a quiet symbol of progress. Even as the umbrella faded into mundanity, it carried quiet symbolic power. It represented modernity, not in the way steam engines or gas lamps did, but in the more subtle sense of everyday transformation. It showed how society could change slowly, without fanfare, without revolution, through practicality, persistence, and thousands of tiny decisions made by ordinary people in the rain. Umbrellas appeared more and more frequently in art and literature. By the time of Honoré de Balzac, who often wrote about bourgeois life in Paris, umbrella-carrying characters were unremarkable, even predictable. By the time of Émile Zola, umbrellas were used to signal mood or weather more than class. And of course, one cannot forget Gustave Caillebot's famous 1877 painting, Paris Street, Rainy Day. It depicts well-dressed Parisians calmly walking the streets under umbrellas with no tension, no conflict, no irony. The umbrella had arrived, echoes in modern times. When you walk through Paris today, past the Seine, the alleyways of Le Marais, or the wide boulevards of Haussmann, you'll see umbrellas in all shapes, colors, and materials. You might even find vending machines that sell disposable ones near metro stations. No one will stare, no coach driver will yell, and no one will mutter Angler under their breath. But if you look closely, especially on a rainy day, you might notice something more: how people unconsciously follow the rules that were once so fiercely debated, how they angle their umbrellas just slightly to avoid clashing with another, how they close them carefully before stepping inside, how they hold them not as accessories, but as natural extensions of themselves. That's the thing about history. Even its most trivial objects, like the umbrella, carry deep stories. Next time you open yours, consider this. You are holding not just a shield against rain, but a quiet relic of cultural rebellion. An object once feared, mocked, and debated in the salons and side streets of Paris. A thing that reshaped how people walked through their cities, and how cities learned to let them. What other tools, we might wonder, are we resisting today, quietly, irrationally, without ever realizing that they, too, may someday become ordinary? Story 2. The medieval fear of peas. Why a common food was once considered dangerous. The pulse of superstition. When you picture the diet of a medieval peasant, you probably imagine something humble: bread, ale, root vegetables, perhaps the occasional fish or cheese. And somewhere on that list, maybe at the bottom, you might imagine legumes, beans, lentils, chickpeas, or peas. Simple, earthy, and filling. But you may be surprised to learn that peas, especially dried green peas, were once the subject of deep suspicion in parts of medieval Europe. For centuries, they were linked to disease, spiritual impurity, and even death. There was a time when people feared peas in a way that seems almost absurd today, yet this fear reveals something important about the way people understand their world, not through science, but through superstition, tradition, and the fragile balance of survival. To understand this peculiar fear, we must first understand how people of the Middle Ages thought about food. For them, eating was not just nourishment, it was a reflection of the soul, the body's balance, and the natural order. The humoral theory and food. Throughout the medieval period, health was governed by the ancient concept of humoral theory, inherited from Greco-Roman medicine. The body was thought to be composed of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, both physical and mental, was believed to result from an imbalance of these fluids. Food, then, was not just caloric, it was medicinal, and potentially dangerous if not matched correctly to a person's individual constitution. Every food had qualities: hot or cold, moist or dry. Peas, according to many physicians, were cold and dry. This meant that for someone already suffering from an excess of coldness, perhaps a melancholy temperament, or someone recovering from a winter illness, eating peas could worsen their condition. The dryness was also thought to cause blockages in the digestive system, leading to obstruction of the bowels or wind trapped in the gut. In an age without plumbing or modern medicine, such conditions could easily become fatal. Peas, in this sense, were feared not for what they were, but for how they behaved inside the body as invisible agents of imbalance. The digestive dread. Dried peas were particularly suspect. When soaked and cooked, they were dense, filling, and notably gas-producing. Flatulence, in medieval medical thought, was not simply embarrassing or uncomfortable. It was dangerous. It indicated internal disorder, the stirring of unhealthy vapors within the body. Worse still, in religious language, it was sometimes associated with sin, a loss of bodily control. Monastic orders, which kept detailed food records, and dietary restrictions, often avoided dried legumes altogether. Many monks were forbidden from eating peas or beans during certain fasts or holy days, believing that the heaviness of such food interfered with spiritual clarity. They preferred lighter, cleaner vegetables, leafy greens, leeks, and the humble turnip. Even among common folk, who depended on pulses for nutrition, there lingered an unease. Children were often fed oats or mashed root vegetables instead of peas. Pregnant women were warned against eating them, lest they produced children with stubborn bellies or bad humors. And in times of plague or fever, households would deliberately avoid peas, fearing that they clogged the spirit and made the body more prone to corruption. That associations with the poor and the sick. Peas were cheap. That was part of the problem. In an era where class dictated consumption, wealthy households avoided foods associated with the peasantry. Dried peas were durable, easy to store, and ideal for feeding large groups, especially prisoners, laborers, or the ill. Hospitals served them, often boiled into thin mush. Monasteries gave them to the poor during charity meals, and in times of famine, they were one of the few things that could be harvested or stored for hard winters. But their very abundance made them suspect. To the elite, food scarcity implied value. If something was always available, it must be low in quality, and possibly harmful. Doctors writing for noble patrons often advised against the regular consumption of pulses, citing their heaviness and lack of refinement. More troublingly, peas were associated with mass death. During several outbreaks of famine and disease, particularly the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, dried peas and beans became staples, as grains failed and livestock died. Yet during these same years, many people fell ill after eating improperly stored legumes. Mold, rot, and fermentation led to poisoning. Though the science of foodborne illness was unknown, people connected the dots. The more peas people ate, the more people died. The logic was flawed but compelling. This led to regional bans or religious advisories. In some towns, church authorities instructed the poor not to eat peas during Lent, offering salted fish or bread instead. In others, physicians advised against them in hot weather, fearing that they heated the stomach and invited pestilence. Peas in popular superstition. Beyond medicine, peas had a strange role in folklore. In Germanic and Slavic traditions, peas were sometimes linked to witchcraft. A scattered pile of dried peas could be used to confuse or distract evil spirits. Witches, it was said, might throw peas at a doorstep to curse the inhabitants with confusion or misfortune. In other stories, peas were used in fertility spells, both to encourage and prevent pregnancy. Depending on the ritual, one common superstition involved planting peas during a waning moon. If planted during the wrong phase, it was believed the crop would grow sickly, and those who ate from it would suffer nightmares or unclean thoughts. In parts of medieval France, a strange tradition emerged. Newlyweds were discouraged from eating peas during the first year of marriage. Why? Because it was believed that peas made the blood lazy, and newlyweds were expected to be active, both in body and spirit. In this logic, peas became symbolic of lethargy, passivity, and even moral weakness. And yet, despite all these fears and taboos, people still ate peas. They had to. Food was not about choice, it was about survival. So how did ordinary people balance necessity with fear? Often they tried to cook the risk away, cooking as protection. Peas were rarely eaten alone. In medieval cookbooks, you'll find peas boiled with garlic, onions, leeks, vinegar, and strong herbs like sage or marjoram. These additions were not just for taste, they were medicinal correctives. Garlic was thought to warm the body and purify the blood. Vinegar aided digestion, herbs brought balance. Together, they transformed the dangerous pulse into something more neutral. One physician in 14th century Italy recommended soaking peas in wine overnight before boiling them, then straining them through a fine cloth and adding cinnamon. This process, he claimed, removed their heaviness and wickedness. The poor couldn't always follow such prescriptions, of course, but even in peasant communities, certain customs were followed. Peas were often eaten in soups, not as solids. They were mashed into pastes, making them easier to digest, and they were often eaten with bread, believed to help carry the food through the body and soften its effects. Still, in times of illness, people avoided them when they could. Even today, some folk traditions in Europe maintain a lingering hesitation around dried peas during sickness or pregnancy, echoes, perhaps of a deeper medieval anxiety. But how, then, did peas go from feared food to pantry staple? The transformation wasn't sudden, it was gradual, rooted in agricultural change, expanding trade, and changing medical understanding. But perhaps the greatest shift came not from physicians or farmers, but from war. What role did battlefield logistics and the needs of marching armies play in rehabilitating the P? And how did the changing winds of science begin to untangle superstition from sustenance? A labyrinth of letters and roads. By 1830, Joseph Rouland had become a fixture in the Marseille post office. His uniform, a deep navy jacket with gold buttons dulled from constant wear, often bore the faint scent of pipe smoke and the ink of 1,000 letters. Though his primary task remained the delivery of mail, Joseph had begun to take increasing interest in the routes he traveled, less for efficiency and more for accuracy. He began to view the city not just as streets and buildings, but as a breathing network of connections waiting to be documented. What started as scribbles in the margins of his postal schedule quickly grew into worn notebooks filled with drawings of alleys, shop fronts, obscure side paths, and even the changing terrain of market stalls. Joseph noted which cobblestones had sunk, which fences had fallen, which taverns were newly painted. His was not the work of a trained cartographer, yet his meticulous attention to seemingly irrelevant detail resulted in maps more lived in and intimate than anything produced by military engineers. Around this time, the French Ministry of the Interior had quietly begun a movement to standardize addresses and roadways across the nation. Paris in particular had faced difficulties as inconsistent postal routes caused delays in deliveries, affecting everything from newspaper distribution to legal documents. A new term had begun to buzz around bureaucratic halls: logistical modernization. But most of the official surveys were done hastily, by distant administrators who had rarely set foot in the very towns they mapped. It was here, in this quietly disorganized framework, that Joseph Rouland's records began to matter more than anyone could have guessed. One fateful evening, as he sorted mail in the back of the Marseille office under a flickering gas lamp, Joseph overheard two government clerks discussing a failed delivery. A set of court documents had been routed to the wrong quarter, and the blame had landed on a mistranscribed street name. Joseph interrupted politely, offering his notebook where he had annotated a discrepancy in street names dating back 5 years. The clerks stared. Not only had Joseph documented the mistake, but he had cross-referenced it with old city registries, and noted when and why the street name had changed from Rue du Chêne to Rue de la République, after a political scandal had caused the original name to fall from favor. The clerks left with his notes, unsure whether they had just spoken to a civil servant or a savant. Word spread quietly, and by winter Joseph had been summoned to Paris. The train journey was his first time away from Marseille in over a decade. He sat beside the window watching the changing countryside, not with the awe of a man seeing new lands, but with the analytical calm of someone trying to memorize every fork in the road and each rise in elevation. Upon arriving in Paris, Joseph found it not so different from his home city, only louder, denser, and far less organized than its elegant boulevards suggested. He walked the neighborhoods as he had back in Marseille, collecting notes on his way to the ministry. Inside the stone halls of the Ministry of the Interior, Joseph was introduced to officials who oversaw transportation and postal infrastructure. They were surprised to find him without academic degrees or military credentials. But what he lacked in formal training he made up for with clarity of mind and purpose. His maps, when laid out on the long oak tables, were not only legible but had annotations on common traffic patterns, tavern opening hours, and even when neighborhoods were most likely to be congested due to religious processions or fish deliveries. His data wasn't just precise, it was useful. Soon, Joseph was unofficially recruited into a new pilot project, the Civilian Routing Survey. Its aim was deceptively simple: to create usable postal maps based on real-life routes, not theoretical city plans. Rouland would work with local postmen across various provinces, gathering first-hand knowledge to refine postal deliveries and ultimately the broader understanding of French geography. What followed were months of quiet but significant contributions. Joseph helped train other postmen to keep route diaries. He encouraged them to include notes on weather, terrain, foot traffic, and resident quirks. If a house number was missing or replaced by a carved symbol on a wooden door, it was worth noting. If a street had 3 names depending on which neighbor you asked, that too went into the record. What made Rouland different from the bureaucrats was his humanity. He didn't view a village as a dot on a map. He saw it as a constellation of people, stories, habits, and rhythms. In this he was remarkably ahead of his time. At one point, Rouland traveled to the village of RLs to help test the new mapping guidelines. He stayed at a small inn run by a widow and her son, and every morning before sunrise he would walk the streets alone, listening to the sounds of roosters, distant church bells, and fishermen beginning their day. He returned with pages of notes, not just distances between landmarks, but descriptions of stone textures, shadows cast at midday, and the scent of baking bread near the baker's square. In Roulin's mind, maps were more than charts. They were ways to honor how people lived in place and time, but not everyone was impressed. Some within the ministry found Joseph's work too sentimental, even frivolous. "We need roads and routes," one official reportedly said, not diary entries and tavern names. There were calls to halt the project or hand it over to professional cartographers. Still, a few high-ranking members, including the minister himself, saw the value in route approach, particularly after a successful test where mail delivery time in 3 departments decreased by nearly 30%. This small, quiet victory ensured the program's continuation. And Roulin, modest as always, simply returned to the field, happier on foot with a notebook than behind a desk. One of the lesser-known consequences of Roulin's work was the ripple it caused across other parts of government. Census collectors began adopting similar methods, adding personal observations alongside data. Road engineers quietly consulted his maps before breaking ground on new projects. Even railway planners found his regional notebooks helpful in understanding the feel of a town, which influenced the placement of future stations. Joseph Roulin, the humble postman of Marseille, was slowly becoming the unwitting architect of a more connected France. But Roulin never sought fame. He returned often to Marseille, where he still delivered letters between long walks and endless note-taking. By 1835 he had amassed over 40 notebooks, detailing not just roads but the lives entwined with them, and then, in 1836, something changed. A request came from an unexpected place, the Royal Military Academy in Paris. They wanted to meet with Roulin not as a postal worker, but as a contributor to national strategy. Why would generals be interested in the sketches of a postman, and what did they see in his maps that others had overlooked? The stamp that changed the world. By the early 1840s, public awareness of Rowland Hill's postal reforms had grown significantly, though met with bureaucratic resistance and a steep wall of skepticism. The momentum of social demand was no longer easy to halt. The Victorian middle class, rising, literate, and impatient, had embraced Hill's ideas. But one obstacle still loomed. How would payment of a letter's postage be simplified for an entire nation? Here entered a curious little object that would quietly revolutionize communication forever: the adhesive postage stamp, the birth of penny black. The idea itself was unpretentious. A small, printed label that, when affixed to a letter, indicated that postage had been prepaid. Hill envisioned it as a solution to the chaos of the previous system, where recipients were often burdened with charges or left to argue over illegible scrawlings of postage due. To implement this, a committee convened, prototypes were debated, ink types tested, paper weighed and assessed. The project, dull to outsiders but monumental to reformers, culminated in what would become the world's first official postage stamp, the penny black, issued on May 1, 1840, but not valid for use until May 6. The penny black featured the profile of Queen Victoria, a young monarch just 3 years into her reign, drawn from a cameo portrait by William Wyon. The design was deliberate, dignified, uniform, and unmistakably official. The word postage sat prominently at the top, while the value, 1 penny, adorned the bottom. The corners bore alphabetical letters to prevent forgery. The novelty of it was striking. For the first time, a letter could be sent anywhere in Britain, for a single penny, if, and only if, the sender affixed the penny black beforehand. It placed responsibility on the sender rather than the receiver, and it made letter sending universally affordable. Adoption and confusion. Yet, as with any bureaucratic innovation, confusion accompanied progress. Not everyone embraced the stamp instantly. The idea of licking a piece of paper and sticking it to a letter struck many as, frankly, distasteful. Others questioned the permanence of the adhesive or complained that the black ink made the cancellation marks too difficult to see. Indeed, that final complaint would soon become a major flaw. Postmasters noticed that cancelled stamps meant to prevent reuse were difficult to distinguish from unused ones, particularly under poor lighting. Unscrupulous senders, not above dampening and reusing lightly cancelled stamps, began to exploit the design flaw. The solution: by 1841, a new version of the stamp was introduced, the penny red, identical in design but printed in red-brown ink. At the same time, Cancellation ink was changed from red to black, improving contrast and deterring fraud. This iterative evolution may seem minor to modern readers, but at the time, it was the height of bureaucratic innovation, an empire learning to speak to itself more clearly. Resistance fades. Reform endures. Despite initial skepticism, the impact of Hill's reforms and the humble stamp was profound. By the end of 1840, over 68 million letters had been sent under the new system, nearly double the volume of the previous year. By 1850, that number had tripled again. Suddenly, a maid could write to her brother in Liverpool. A shoemaker could send a birthday note to his mother in Durham. Students could exchange essays. Lovers could whisper in ink. The barriers, financial, procedural, and bureaucratic, had lowered. Communication was no longer the domain of merchants, aristocrats, and solicitors. It belonged to the public. And for Hill, vindication came, albeit slowly, though he had been dismissed from the Treasury in 1842 due to political turnover and internal hostility. Public support for his vision never wavered. In 1846, under a new government, Hill was reappointed as secretary to the Postmaster General, where he continued to refine the system he had once only imagined. Eventually, in 1854, Hill became secretary to the post office itself, the very institution that had once tried to bury his ideas in red tape. The quiet echoes of a stamp. The penny post system may appear trivial when judged against grander historical milestones, wars, empires, revolutions, yet its influence quietly radiated through every household, factory, and schoolroom. It is no overstatement to say that the infrastructure of modern life, the coordination of industrial societies, the communication of ideas, and the very formation of public opinion rests partially on the bones of Rowland Hill's postal reform and penny black. It remains a coveted collector's item today, its legacy far greater than its tiny square inch suggests. Yet perhaps more valuable than the stamp itself was the idea it represented, that access to communication could be standardized, democratized, and made boringly reliable. So the next time you receive junk mail or a holiday card or a dreaded bill, remember these mundane slips of paper are the great-great-grandchildren of a Victorian idea, licked and stamped into history by an empire learning to write to itself. Story 3. The French Revolution's most unexpected survivor. The tailor who outlived the guillotine. I was no hero, said Leonard Outy, wiping his trembling hands on the coarse apron that still bore stains from another man's collar. I simply survived. In the great halls of Versailles, his fingers once danced with powder and pins, fashioning wigs that would one day wobble atop the powdered brows of dukes and queens. He knew secrets. He heard whispers. He measured the necklines of France's most powerful figures. But Leonard, for all his glamour and connection, was no nobleman. He was a hairdresser. And in the most violent years of the French Revolution, that simple fact, his profession, was what saved his life. The rise of a common man, born in 1751 to a modest Parisian family, Leonard was the eldest of 4 children. His father was a struggling merchant, his mother a seamstress who stitched more dreams than she ever sold. From a young age, Leonard showed a fascination with the theater of appearance. While other boys chased dogs through alleys, Leonard practiced braiding hay into elaborate coifs. By 18, he had moved to Paris. By 24, he had invented a hairstyle so towering, so comically regal, that it caught the attention of a certain Marie Antoinette, the new restless queen who longed for rebellion against boredom, if nothing else. Thus began his ascent. As her official coiffeur, Leonard crafted the infamous pouf hairstyle, a mountainous construct of hair, feathers, baubles, and flower meant to declare femininity, wealth, and French excess all at once. He became part of the Queen's inner court, though he held no title. He was allowed in her chambers. He laced her corsets. He adjusted her wigs during state dinners. When she laughed, he laughed. When she cried, he fetched rouge. And when France began to boil in the late 1780s, Leonard was still there, dutiful, powdered, and terrified. The scent of revolution. The first time Leonard sensed real danger was July 14, 1789. The Bastille had fallen, and Paris vibrated with the screams of starving people. Leonard was in the palace garden that day, trimming a lock of the Queen's hair for a commemorative locket she planned to send to her sister in Vienna. He remembered how she'd flinched when the scissors touched her nape. "Do you hear them?" she whispered. And he had the crowd, distant but not distant enough, like a broken dam of voices, fury, hunger, chance, and blood. The Queen had turned her pale face toward him. "Will they come for me, Leonard?" He had no answer. Within months, the royal family was practically imprisoned in the Tuileries Palace, and the revolution's tide was rising. Nobles fled to Austria, ministers resigned, heads began to roll. But Leonard stayed. Why? Perhaps it was loyalty, perhaps fear, perhaps he believed, as many still did, that the storm would pass. He couldn't have been more wrong. A hairdresser's witness. In 1791, Leonard became an unlikely accomplice to one of history's most audacious failures, the flight of Marie Antoinette, desperate to escape revolutionary Paris with her family, planned a secret journey to the Austrian border, disguised as commoners. Leonard, sworn to secrecy, helped prepare their disguises. He powdered the king's wig to look dusty. He dirtied the queen's cheeks with soot. He helped their children into ill-fitting peasant clothes. He remembered kissing the queen's hand before she left. He remembered the way she looked at Paris through the carriage window like a woman glancing back at a house already burning. 3 days later they were caught, recognized by a postmaster, detained by revolutionaries, and paraded back into the capital like criminals. From that moment, Leonard knew the monarchy would not survive. Escape from Versailles. As 1792 dawned, the revolution reached fever pitch. Radical Jacobin took control of the government. The monarchy was formally abolished. The guillotine, once seen as a swift and humane alternative to the sword, became a daily spectacle in the Place de la Revolution. Leonard's clients, duchesses, barons, courtiers began disappearing. Some fled, most were arrested, a few begged him for disguises. He gave them peasant haircuts and smuggled powder in secret compartments of his satchel. He learned to work with trembling hands and lowered eyes. But when the September massacres began, when angry mobs stormed prisons and executed hundreds of nobles and priests without trial, Leonard knew it was over. He left everything behind. His salon, his savings, his costumes. He shaved his head, burned his powdered wigs, and with a forged work permit as a traveling tailor, he disappeared into the countryside under a false name, Jean-Louis. Life among the dead. For the next 3 years, Leonard wandered southern France, offering haircuts and mending sleeves in dusty towns where revolution's echo was just a whisper. He saw the scars left by the terror. Markets where aristocrats once strutted were now lined with orphans and amputees. Chapels turned to prisons, and every town had at least one empty house the family inside dragged to Paris for trials that ended in the square. He heard whispers of what had become of the Queen. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was led through the jeering crowd, her once silken hair shorn roughly by a prison barber. The same neck he had once perfumed with rose oil now lay on the wooden block of the guillotine. She was 37. Leonard was in a candlelit tavern when he heard the news. He drank a silent toast alone and wept behind a cellar wall. A ghost returns. By 1796, the worst of the terror had passed. Robespierre was dead, devoured by the very guillotine he championed. France was exhausted, blood-drenched, leaderless. Napoleon Bonaparte, an ambitious general who spoke more of victory than virtue, had begun his rise. And Leonard, he returned to Paris. Cautiously, quietly, he reopened a small salon under yet another name. This time he offered no wigs, no perfume, no lace, just practical cuts and quiet conversation. The few clients who recognized him said nothing. Some came just to see if it was truly him. But he never spoke of the Queen again, never styled another. Pouf. Never again answered to the name Leonard Outy, legacy of a witness. In time Napoleon would declare himself emperor. France would shift, and shift again. But through it all, the common post of hairdresser remained somewhere in the city, one survivor of Versailles clipped and trimmed, the ghost of a forgotten court whispering through his scissors. In 1820, a Parisian writer discovered an elderly man living above a cobbler's shop in Mont. He introduced himself simply as Monsieur Fournier. He was quiet, polite. His hands are still steady with scissors, even in old age. But when pressed over wine, in soft candlelight, he told a story. Of queens, of wigs, of secrets, and of the day he watched a monarchy fall, not from a throne, but from a block of wood under a sharpened blade. The fire spreads from hunger to revolt. You left off in the cramped kitchens and dusty alleyways of Paris, where bakers were caught between government mandates and violent mobs. Now, as spring shifted into summer in 1775, the situation across France worsened. The Flower War, as it came to be called, was not a single event. It was a cascade of incidents, an erratic storm of fear, starvation, and fury that began in the markets and spread to the manors and roadsides. And at the center of it all stood the most seemingly innocuous of things: bread. while modern revolutions often cite ideology or democracy as their spark. This prelude to the French Revolution had no slogans and no banners. It was hunger that stirred the streets. Hunger, simple, gnawing, mundane, ignited the fury of a population that had been pushed beyond their limits. The collapse of confidence. The root problem wasn't only poor harvests. France, after all, had known famines before. The deeper crisis in 1775 was about trust or the loss of it. After Turgot, the reformist minister of Louis XVI, abolished price controls on grain in an effort to modernize France's economy. He believed that a free market would regulate itself. In theory, this would incentivize farmers to produce more, merchants to distribute more efficiently, and prices to settle through competition. But France wasn't England, and theory met its limits. Peasants, long accustomed to the crown intervening in grain prices, felt betrayed. They believed, as many in the countryside did, that bakers and grain merchants were hoarding food to drive prices up. Whispers of conspiracy spread like mildew in a damp cellar, that the king's ministers were intentionally starving the poor to feed the rich, or worse, to cull the population. In truth, there was no grand plot, only bad policies and the inertia of centuries of mismanagement. Yet perception can be more powerful than fact. When farmers brought their grain to market, they were greeted not with customers, but with mobs. Villagers seized carts, confiscated wheat, and sold it at just prices. In towns like Étampes, Chartres, and Reims, bakeries were raided, grain convoys were blocked, and sometimes looted. Markets became battlegrounds. The government, slow to react, finally deployed troops, not to bring food but to restore order. The army meets the people. It's worth pausing here to understand what that meant. When an army is sent into a city during a time of starvation, they don't just bring bayonets, they bring fear. The soldiers were under orders to protect merchants and bakers, not to feed the people. Their presence was a message. The rules are changing, and resistance will not be tolerated. But in a land where people barely had shoes, where soup was sometimes made from grass and bark, those rules held little meaning. The people weren't organizing a revolution yet, but they were desperate enough to challenge the social order. In Dijon, the crowd forced bakers to sell their loaves at low prices under armed guard. In Trouay, a market square turned into chaos. When a rumor spread that a merchant had hidden sacks of flour in a barn, dozens of villagers ransacked the building, only to find straw. These weren't professional agitators. They were farmers, mothers, apprentices, and washerwomen. Their weapons were kitchen knives, scythes, and heavy stones. Their aim wasn't political, it was survival. Echoes in the palace. Meanwhile, in Versailles, the murmurs reached the court. The young king, Louis XVI, was only 20 at the time. His marriage to Marie Antoinette was still fresh, and the grandeur of court life occupied much of his attention. Turgot, ever the Enlightenment man, insisted that liberalizing the grain market would, in time, improve the lives of the poor. In time was a luxury the hungry couldn't afford. Madame de Polignac, a favorite of the Queen, reportedly commented that it was better for the market to be free, even if it meant a few months of disorder. Others at court scoffed at the panic of the poor, calling them superstitious, ungrateful, and easily misled. This disdain would cost them dearly in the years ahead. Still, Louis XVI eventually ordered the reinstatement of some price controls, a quiet admission that the experiment had failed, but it was too late. The idea that the monarchy would protect its people had begun to erode. The flour war had changed something fundamental. The belief that the king's hand rested gently over his subjects, a kingdom of riots. By late May 1775, reports were coming in almost daily. In Orleans, an entire shipment of grain was seized by villagers, redistributed by hand, and guarded overnight by a chain of peasants holding torches. They called it the People's Justice. In Lille, a group of women refused to leave a bakery until prices were high. When the baker refused, they overturned his carts and dumped the loaves into the street. In some cases, local magistrates sided with the crowds not out of sympathy, but out of fear. The unrest had outgrown its origins. This wasn't just about flour anymore, it was about who controlled food, who set the rules, and who deserved to eat. Farmers stopped bringing grain to market altogether, afraid of theft or worse. This created a vicious cycle. Less food in the cities meant more riots, which meant more fear, and even less trade. France, in a matter of weeks, had gone from a stable monarchy to a landscape where the rules of exchange had collapsed. And yet, remarkably, most of the rioters still carried no banners, made no speeches, and spoke of no revolution. They didn't want to overthrow the king, They simply wanted bread, punishment and memory. Eventually, the army reasserted control. Hundreds were arrested. Dozens were hanged. Others were sent to the galleys or imprisoned without trial. In Chartres, soldiers dragged accused grain thieves through the streets in shackles, making an example of them. But something had shifted. In Parisian coiffures, the word justice was now spoken with a bitter edge. The pamphlets that circulated in underground print shops no longer praised the crown. Enlightenment thinkers took note. Rousseau and Diderot saw in these riots the natural consequence of inequality. What began as a chain of disconnected uprisings in 1775 would, over the next 14 years, fester into open rebellion. The Flower War had been put down, yes, but it had shown the people something they wouldn't forget, that hunger was stronger than loyalty. And in the memory of those who witnessed it, the fear wasn't just of famine, it was of the silence that followed, when justice did not come. In the next section we'll explore how the lessons of the Flower War, the panic, the violence, and the public hunger echoed directly into the early days of the French Revolution. How did a conflict over bread become the foundation of revolution? The days that disappeared, when Pope Gregory XIII signed the papal bull Inter Gravissimus in February 1582. There was no turning back. A decision had been made that would permanently alter timekeeping throughout the Western world. The Julian calendars, long slow drift away from the solar year, had to be corrected. But in the practical world of kings, merchants, monks, and laborers, the sudden loss of 10 days from the year was far more disorienting than anyone anticipated. In this final part of our story, we'll travel with the reform itself, how it was implemented across cities and countries, how the people reacted sometimes with bemusement, sometimes with outright violence, and how the calendar we know today came into being not through scientific consensus alone, but through the messy machinery of power, politics, and public confusion. The leap, October 4th to October 15. In the city of Rome, where the decree originated, the changeover was swift. The Papal States adopted the new calendar without hesitation. When the people went to bed on Thursday, October 4th, 1582, they awoke the next morning to Friday, October 15th. 10 days were gone by the stroke of a pen and the chiming of the cathedral bells. One could imagine a sleepy Roman merchant blinking at his books and whispering, "Where did last week go?" But Rome adapted quickly, for the papal mandate carried the weight of divine authority. The churches followed suit, skipping feast days that no longer existed. It was not a perfect transition. Weddings scheduled on the vanished days had to be rescheduled. A few creditors tried to demand interest for days that technically never happened, only to be met with irritated refusal. Outside the Papal States, however, things were more complicated. Spain and Portugal, following Rome's lead, Spain and Portugal, deeply Catholic and closely tied to the Vatican, also made the jump in October 1582. Spanish colonies, stretching from Mexico to the Philippines, followed in tandem. In Seville, merchants were instructed to adjust contracts and ledgers immediately. In Lisbon, rumors spread briefly that the king had declared a new season of taxation by manipulating the calendar, but clerics reassured the public from the pulpit. In these deeply religious kingdoms, the change was viewed not with fear but with obedience. Yet, even among the faithful, questions lingered. What happened to the saints whose feast days were lost? Did they mind? Were their blessings also erased with the calendar? A priest in Toledo wrote in his diary that he simply celebrated St. Francis's feast day a week late. The saint, he wrote, is eternal, and so may his day be moved for the sake of heaven's harmony. France, discontent in the provinces. France, under King Henry III, adopted the calendar reform with relative efficiency, but the shift exposed the tension between Paris and the rural provinces. In the capital, scholars welcomed the update. The University of Paris, long a center of learning, had advocated for correction for decades, but in the countryside, peasants, ACCUSED tax collectors are manipulating the calendar to extract more labor. Farmers believed they were being cheated out of fair reckoning for rents and leases. In Brittany, a group of villagers refused to accept the new calendar. A small riot broke out when a local bailiff tried to enforce the changed festival dates. The protesters were arrested and fined not for rejecting the calendar, but for disturbing the peace. The authorities, pragmatic above all, understood that time, once regulated by the church, was now a tool of the state. Germany, Protestant skepticism and delay. Not all of Europe jumped at the Pope's command. In the Holy Roman Empire particularly, in the Protestant north, the reaction was more cautious, even hostile. The Lutheran and Calvinist territories viewed the Gregorian reform as a papal plot. Why? They asked. Should they trust Rome to regulate time itself? Martin Luther had been dead for decades, but his suspicion of papal authority still resonated. For nearly a century, Protestant states refused to adopt the new calendar. This caused real confusion. In cities like Augsburg, which had both Catholic and Protestant populations, there were two calendars in use at the same time. A Catholic might say it was March 15th, while their Protestant neighbor claimed it was March 5th. Business contracts required careful notation. Letters between regions had to date. A merchant might write. Arriving on the 3rd, 13th of April, God willing. For travelers and traders, the risk of missing a market or court date due to calendar confusion became a real concern. England, the long wait and the short riot. Perhaps nowhere was the reaction to the Gregorian calendar more contentious than in England, still firmly Protestant and politically opposed to Rome. The English crown ignored the papal reform altogether. As a result, the English stuck with the Julian calendar for nearly 170 more years. It wasn't until 1752, during the reign of King George II, that Britain finally adopted the Gregorian calendar, and by then the correction had grown to 11 days. The change was not subtle. Parliament passed the Calendar New Style Act of 1750, declaring that Wednesday, September 2nd, 1752, would be followed by Thursday, September 14th. Again the calendar leapt forward, and again the people were bewildered. The famous, though probably apocryphal, "Give us our 11 days." Riots were said to erupt as confused citizens demanded the government return their missing time. The myth captured public imagination and has been repeated for centuries. Even though there is little historical evidence for mass uprisings, still, the transition was confusing. Birthdays, debts, and seasonal markers were all affected. In the city of London, printers rushed to sell updated almanacs and calendars. Clerks worked overtime adjusting legal documents. Some believed that their lives had been shortened. A group of farm workers in Devon even refused to harvest grain, insisting it was too early. Russia and the Orthodox East. Isolation in time. Russia, under the Orthodox Church, resisted the Gregorian calendar until the very beginning of the 20th century. In fact, it wasn't until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918 that Soviet Russia made the switch, in part to align better with Western trade and diplomacy. By then, the Julian calendar was 13 days out of sync with the Gregorian one. This time gap is why, even today, Russian Orthodox holidays are often celebrated late by Western reckoning. Christmas on January 7th, that's December 25th, old style. The calendar shift was emblematic of Russia's long-standing cultural divide from Western Europe. As the Tsars resisted outside influence, so too did they cling to their calendar, even as the seasons slipped out of sync with celestial events. Calendars as instruments of power. As we draw this story to a close, consider this. The calendar is not just a neutral record of days. It is a political instrument. It governs taxation, determines religious observance, regulates farming cycles, and defines legal deadlines. When Pope Gregory XIII introduced the reform, he was not merely correcting a mathematical error. He was asserting papal authority over the very structure of time. And when monarchs resisted or delayed its adoption, they were making a political statement, not a scientific one. The Gregorian calendar eventually became standard, not because it was inherently superior, but because its adoption aligned with expanding empires, trade networks, and centralized states. And so, the city that changed the calendar, Rome, did not do so with soldiers or ships, but with a papal decree and a set of astronomical calculations. In doing so, it shaped how nearly every modern society experiences time itself. But let us pause with one final thought. If 10 days can simply vanish from history with the approval of church and state, what else, in our carefully organized timelines, has been silently erased? Story 4. The church bells that decided a war, the ringing that changed everything. You may not think twice when you hear the toll of a church bell. Maybe a call to mass, a sign of the hour, or simply background noise from a distant steeple. There was a time when the ringing of bells did far more than mark the passage of time. In certain corners of medieval and early modern Europe, the ringing of bells was a political act, a military strategy, and in some cases, the decisive factor in a war. This is the story of the Battle of Ghent, 1380, and how a series of church bells, yes, bells, helped shape the outcome of a conflict and redefined the symbolic power of sound in times of war. To understand why bells were so important, You first have to understand how cities like Ghent worked during the 14th century. At the time, Ghent was part of the County of Flanders, a wealthy and fiercely independent region within the larger Holy Roman Empire. Flanders had long been caught between two powerful influences: its economic ties with England through the wool trade, and its political obligations to France, whose king claimed supremacy over the region. Ghent itself was a hotbed of rebellion. The city was wealthy, full of skilled textile workers and independent-minded burghers. These citizens were proud, often stubborn, and not easily swayed by monarchs or nobles. The city had its own militia, its own rules, and even its own way of making war. By 1379, tensions between Ghent and the Count of Flanders, Louis II, had reached a boiling point. Louis, aligned with the French crown, sought to impose his authority on the city, which had long acted like an independent republic. When the people of Ghent refused to pay new taxes and resisted interference in their wool trade, Louis responded. With military force, the people of Ghent rose up under the leadership of a man named Philip van Artevelde, the son of a former civic leader who had led a similar rebellion a generation earlier. This rebellion was not a minor skirmish, it turned into a full-fledged civil war. And it's here that simple, clanging, unmelodious church bells began to take on a surprising new role. In medieval cities, church bells were central to civic life. They marked hours, called people to prayer, and alerted the population to fires or invasions. But in Ghent, the bells had another use. The city had developed an elaborate code of bell signals that could call out militias, direct the flow of people in an emergency, or communicate orders across the city without the use of runners or messengers. This was no simple town crier's call. It was a well-coordinated system of mass communication. Each bell had a name and a purpose. The massive bell Roland, which hung in the belfry of Ghent, was considered the voice of the people. When Roland rang, it wasn't just a call to prayer. It was a signal that something of grave importance was unfolding. The citizens had come to associate its toll with resistance, independence, and often war. By early 1380, as Philip van Artevelde's forces clashed with those loyal to Count Louis, the bell Roland rang almost daily. Sometimes it meant the approach of enemy troops. Other times it summoned every able-bodied man to defend the gates. But what made this more remarkable was that Ghent's neighboring towns, Bruges, Ypres, and others also had bells, and these cities had begun to mimic Ghent's use of them. Soon, entire regions of Flanders were communicating by bell signals. This bell network allowed the rebel forces to coordinate defenses without written messages or couriers. In an era before telegraphs or radios, this was revolutionary. Even more, it unified the population in a way that few other methods could. When Roland rang, men dropped their tools, women gathered children, and everyone moved according to pre-planned patterns. Markets closed, bridges were drawn, and gates fortified, all in minutes. For Count Louis and his army, this was deeply frustrating. His forces, although professional and better equipped, were slow to move and depended on supply lines and orders from Paris. In contrast, the rebel militias could appear and vanish like smoke, aided by the bells that summoned or dismissed them at a moment's notice. But bells weren't just a tactical advantage, they were a symbol. Louis understood this. In fact, when his forces briefly took control of a town loyal to Ghent, one of the first orders he issued was to silence its bells. In Bruges he had the city's great bell removed and melted down. The message was clear: without their voice, the people would lose their unity. Back in Ghent, this made Roland more than just metal and rope. It became a holy relic of the rebellion. Guards were posted at the belfry, not to protect it from fire or lightning, but from sabotage. Secret passages were constructed to reach the tower in case it was under siege. Children were taught the meaning of each toll. It's not an exaggeration to say that Roland became more important than any single general or fortress. There was even a popular phrase in Ghent at the time: when Roland rings, the people reign. And so the war continued, and with every ring of Roland, the rebels grew bolder. But Louis had not given up. He petitioned the French king for support, and a royal army began to mobilize. Their goal was simple: to take Ghent, destroy Roland, and end the rebellion once and for all. But Ghent had one more surprise left. During the spring of 1380, under cover of night and coordinated entirely by bell signals, the rebel militias launched a daring raid on a supply depot that had been set up just outside the city. Hundreds of men, each summoned by a sequence of tolls, appeared at precise times and locations. The depot was burned to the ground before the enemy even knew what was happening. This raid enraged Louis and convinced the French crown that Ghent needed to be crushed completely. Plans were drawn for a siege. The royal army would arrive by summer. Inside Ghent, preparations began. Trenches were dug, walls repaired, and the people waited, watching the horizon, listening for the bells. And at the heart of it all stood the belfry, with Roland hanging silently above them, waiting to speak. The siege and the sound of resistance. When the summer of 1380 arrived, the tension in Ghent was almost palpable. The city's streets, usually alive with the chatter of merchants and the clang of looms, now echoed with the rhythmic pounding of hammer on stone, the hurried footsteps of militiamen, and the tolling of bells, ever more urgent, ever more insistent. The royal army, sent by King Charles VI of France to aid Count Louis II of Flanders, had gathered near the city's outskirts. Their numbers were overwhelming, a mix of seasoned knights, archers, and mercenaries, all intent on bringing Ghent's rebellion to an end. Yet inside the city walls, the spirit of defiance burned brighter than ever. Ghent's leaders, both elected and military, knew that open battle against the king's army would be folly. The city's strength lay in its walls, its knowledge of the narrow streets, and above all, its unity. The bells, those stalwart voices in the belfry and church towers, were to be the lifeline of this unity. Each neighborhood had its designated bell signal, a unique pattern of tolls and pauses that could summon defenders, warn of infiltration, or order a strategic retreat. The coordination was so refined that even the slightest changes in tolling could carry detailed instructions. For example, 3 short tolls followed by a long ring meant enemy approaching from the east gate, while a steady, rhythmic toll called the city's archers to their posts. Residents learned to recognize these signals as second nature. Women, who normally tended to markets or children, would stop instantly and move to fortify entrances. Blacksmiths put down their tools to fashion weapons. Traders transformed their carts into barricades. It was a city transformed into a fortress, animated by sound. In late July, the siege began. The French forces encircled Ghent, cutting off supplies and communication. Siege engines were wheeled into position, and catapults hurled stones and incendiary devices against the city's walls. Despite the bombardment, the people of Ghent held firm. The bells rang incessantly, rallying defenders to patch breaches and repel attackers. At times, the ringing itself seemed to frustrate the besiegers, who reported that the unrelenting sound made it difficult to coordinate their own maneuvers. The bells, in a sense, had become a weapon. One chronicler of the siege wrote, "The sound of Roland and all his kin was like thunder in the ears of our enemies. It bolstered the hearts of the defenders and drove the attackers to despair." The ringing of bells was more than practical, it was psychological. For the citizens of Ghent, the sound was a reminder that they were not alone. For soldiers on the wall, it was a call to courage in the face of fire and sword. For the French army, the bells signified something else entirely. Each toll was a constant reminder that Ghent's people were united, defiant, and ready to fight. Rumors spread among the ranks that the city's bell ringers were as skilled in subterfuge and sabotage as the city's archers. The French commander, Duke Philip the Bold, ordered attempts to silence the bells. Scouts were sent to infiltrate the city and sabotage the bell towers. But Ghent's defenders anticipated such moves, and bell towers were heavily guarded. The conflict of the siege was not only fought with swords and stones, but also with signals and spies. At night, small groups of Ghent's militiamen would slip beyond the walls to harass enemy camps, disrupt supply lines, or set fires. These raids were coordinated through subtle bell signals, a pattern heard only by those inside the city. In one daring attack, messengers climbed the belfry to ring a rapid rhythmic code, signaling a group of militia to intercept a convoy bringing siege equipment. The convoy was ambushed, its carts burned, and the French army forced to delay their assault in retaliation. The French sent spies disguised as peasants into Ghent, hoping to steal the bell-ringing codes. Several spies were caught and publicly executed, their bodies displayed near the belfry as a warning. As the siege dragged on, shortages began to bite, food stores dwindled, water became scarce, disease spread in the cramped streets. Despite this, the bells continued to ring, sometimes faint, sometimes strong, never ceasing their calls to vigilance. The siege also exposed fissures within Ghent. Some nobles and merchants began to question whether continued resistance was worth the cost. But the city's artisans, workers, and militia refused to yield. One notable figure was a woman named Jeanne de Gistel, a baker's wife who became a messenger and a morale booster. She would climb the stairs to the belfry daily to hear the bells and pass messages to the defenders below. Her courage became legendary. symbolizing the city's indomitable spirit. In October 1380, after months of siege, a critical event shifted the war's course. A French supply convoy, attempting to bring reinforcements and food to the army, was ambushed by a coalition of Ghent's militia and forces from neighboring rebel cities, all coordinated through bell signals. The convoy was destroyed, and French morale plummeted. Simultaneously, internal strife in the French court distracted King Charles VI, and reinforcements intended for Ghent were diverted elsewhere. Seizing the opportunity, Philip van Artevelde led a sortie, a bold attack against a poorly defended French camp. The rebels' success was heralded by the ringing of the bells, which spread news of the victory throughout the city. Though the rebellion would eventually be crushed the following year, the siege of Ghent became a symbol of urban resistance and the innovative use of communication in warfare. The use of bells to coordinate military actions was studied by armies for centuries afterward, a precursor to later signal systems. For the people of Ghent, the bells remained sacred, symbols of their unity and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The final toll and the echoes of defiance. The bitter winter of 1381 settled over Flanders like a shroud, and with it came the end of one of the most remarkable sieges in medieval Europe, the Siege of Ghent. The city's walls still stood, its bells still hung in the belfry, but the rebellion led by Philip van Artevelde was nearing its final, tragic chapter. In this last section, we will follow the fall of the rebellion, the fate of the bells that had once summoned hope and resistance, and how the legacy of those ringing voices shaped the history and identity of Ghent for centuries to come. Despite the courage and cunning displayed by Ghent's citizens, the siege weighed heavily on the city. The royal army, reinforced and patient, tightened its grip. Starvation and disease sapped the strength of the population. Even the bells, which once rang so boldly, began to toll with a different tone, one of warning and mourning. In July 1381, after nearly a year of blockade and sporadic fighting, Philip van Artevelde met his end in the Battle of Roosbeek. The rebels were decisively defeated by the forces of King Charles VI and Count Louis II, with van Artevelde himself falling on the field. His death was a crushing blow to the morale of Ghent's defenders. The city, bereft of its leader and worn down by siege, was forced to surrender. Terms were harsh, but surprisingly lenient compared to other rebellions of the time. The city had to dismantle some of its fortifications and accept the authority of the Count, but many privileges were maintained. One question lingered: what would happen to the great bell Roland, the voice of the people and the symbol of rebellion? To the surprise of many, Count Louis did not order Roland's destruction. Instead, he allowed it to remain hanging in the belfry. There was a tacit acknowledgement of the bell's power, not merely as a tool but as a monument to the city's spirit. This decision was unusual. In many other rebellious cities, authorities crushed symbols of defiance, burning banners, tearing down statues, melting bells into cannonballs. Roland survived. Over the following decades, the belfry and its bells became a focal point of Ghent's identity. The city repaired and strengthened the tower, adding new bells alongside Roland, each with its own name and purpose. The ringing rituals became elaborate civic ceremonies, reminding citizens of their history of resistance. The role of bells in Ghent evolved beyond military communication. They became a symbol of the city's autonomy and pride. Guilds sponsored new bells, each inscribed with dedications to saints, patrons, or historic events. Every year the city celebrates the Feast of the Bells, where the entire population gathers in the square below the belfry. The bells rang out in complex patterns, telling stories of past victories and losses, hopes and fears. Children were taught the significance of each toll, ensuring the memory of the rebellion passed from generation to generation. The bells also served a social purpose. Their peals marked the hours for work and rest, celebrated weddings, and mourned the dead. They were woven into the fabric of daily life, a constant reminder that, though the rebellion had failed, the spirit of the people endured. The Siege of Ghent and its ringing bells had lasting effects far beyond the city walls. Firstly, the use of bells as a communication system influenced other European cities. In the centuries that followed, cities like Bruges, Ypres, and even London developed complex bell codes for warning of fires, invasions, or public announcements. This method was particularly valuable before the invention of modern communication technologies. Secondly, Ghent's rebellion became a case study in urban resistance. It showed how a city's unity, combined with innovative use of existing technologies like bell signals, could resist far more powerful feudal and royal forces. if only temporarily. Finally, the symbolism of Roland and the belfry entered Flemish folklore and literature. Poets, painters, and musicians immortalized the story of the bells that refused to be silenced, framing them as the voice of freedom and the conscience of the people. If you visit Ghent now, you can still hear the bells ringing from the belfry, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Roland's deep sonorous tone still carries over the rooftops on special occasions, reminding the city's residents of their ancestors' defiance and resilience. The belfry stands not only as an architectural marvel but as a monument to a time when sound itself became a weapon and a beacon. For modern visitors and historians alike, the bells represent more than just metal and rope. They are a testament to the power of communication, the importance of community, and the enduring human desire for autonomy. So, the next time you hear the toll of a distant church bell or clock tower, remember this: those sounds carry the weight of history. They speak of communities united, of warnings sounded in the dead of night, of battles won and lost without a single sword drawn in the streets. And they remind us that sometimes the quietest things, like the ringing of a bell, can have the loudest impact. Story 5. The Great Molasses Flood of Boston, a sticky disaster brewing. You might not expect molasses to cause a disaster on the scale of a flood, but in the bustling city of Boston in the early 20th century, this thick, sticky syrup became the source of one of the most bizarre and devastating accidents in American urban history. The Great Molasses Flood, as it's now known, transformed quiet streets into a chaotic river of destruction, killing people, animals, and uprooting the very fabric of the neighborhood. This story is not just about an unusual flood, but about industrial ambition, urban growth, and the precarious balance between human engineering and nature's unpredictable forces. Boston in 1919 was a city straining under rapid industrialization and urban expansion. The North End, the area where the disaster would strike, was densely packed with immigrant families, narrow streets, and factories that churned day and night. It was a working-class neighborhood, full of small shops, tenements, bakeries, and docks where goods came and went. Molasses was a valuable commodity in Boston. It was used in baking, brewing, and even for industrial purposes. One of the biggest suppliers was the Purity Distilling Company, which stored massive quantities of molasses in a giant steel tank near the waterfront. This tank was no ordinary container. It was about 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, capable of holding 2.3 million gallons of molasses, enough to fill an Olympic swimming pool nearly 4 times over. Its size was both a marvel of engineering and a ticking time bomb. From the moment it was built in 1915, there were murmurs of concern about the tank's construction. Residents nearby complained about strange noises, groans and creaks, as if the metal itself was straining. Engineers had reportedly warned that the tank was rushed through construction without proper safety checks. The steel used was thinner than recommended. Welds were poorly done. The tank leaked molasses regularly, leaving sticky puddles around its base. Workers tasked with cleaning up these leaks wore boots coated in molasses that hardened over time. Purity Distilling, under pressure to meet post-World War I demand for alcohol molasses being used for ethanol production, pushed to fill and use the tank despite warnings. January 15, 1919, began as a cold, cloudy winter day. The temperature was rising after a bitter freeze, causing the molasses inside the tank to warm and expand. At approximately 12:30 p.m., without warning, the tank's steel shell suddenly ruptured. What followed was terrifying. Over 2 million gallons of molasses surged out in a wave estimated to be 25 feet high at its peak. It raced through the narrow streets at about 35 miles per hour, a speed that would surprise anyone who has ever dealt with the thick syrup's usual slow flow. Buildings were crushed under the weight, streets flooded with sticky, sweet liquid that trapped people and animals alike. Horses pulling carts were caught and drowned in the flood. Cars were swept off the road or pinned under debris. The scene was one of chaos and confusion. People ran for their lives, but many were caught or slowed by the molasses. The flood didn't just destroy property, it claimed 21 lives, and over 150 were injured. Rescue efforts were complicated by the nature of molasses itself. The sticky syrup clung to everything. Rescuers found it difficult to move through the floodwaters or to pull victims free. The cold temperatures slowed recovery, as molasses hardened quickly once exposed to the winter air. In the days following, the city smelled of molasses for months. Cleaning crews worked tirelessly to scrub streets and buildings. The flood left a lasting mark on Boston, both physically and in the collective memory of its residents. The day after the molasses flood, Boston was a city in shock. Streets were coated with sticky residue, buildings were splattered from top to bottom with brown syrup, and the air still carried the thick, sweet scent of molasses. The North End neighborhood had been transformed into something unrecognizable, a sticky wasteland filled with wreckage and heartbreak. As the city's residents tried to come to terms with the disaster, the search for answers began. How could a massive steel tank, designed to hold millions of gallons of thick liquid, suddenly rupture and send a deadly wave through the streets? The questions were urgent, and the answers complex. Rescue workers faced extraordinary challenges. Molasses is not like water, it's far more viscous, making movement through it slow and exhausting. Victims were found trapped under debris or stuck in thick pools, unable to free themselves. Some were pulled from the floodwaters with molasses clinging so heavily that it took hours to clean the sticky substance off their bodies. Horses, vital to the city's economy for transport and hauling goods, were caught in the flood. Many drowned, while others suffered severe injuries. The loss of animals added to the community's grief and disrupted daily life. Volunteers, firemen, and police officers worked tirelessly in the freezing winter weather. They struggled to clear the molasses from streets and buildings, using hot water hoses and scrubbing crews. The cleanup took months, and for years afterward, residents complained that their houses, windows, and even clothing retained the smell of molasses. As soon as the immediate emergency was under control, attention turned to investigating the cause of the tank's failure. Engineers, city officials, and company representatives began inspecting the ruins. Preliminary findings were alarming. The tank had shown numerous structural weaknesses, including thin steel plates that buckled under pressure, welds that were faulty or incomplete, visible leaks that had been ignored or poorly managed. A major contributing factor was the temperature change. The day of the flood had seen a rapid thaw after days of freezing cold. Molasses inside the tank, which had been chilled and thickened, suddenly began to warm and expand. The tank, already weak, could not contain the increased pressure. The company, responsible for the tank, Purity Distilling, faced immediate backlash. Reports surfaced that company officials had ignored warnings about the tank's safety and rushed construction to meet growing demand for industrial alcohol, especially as the United States had recently entered Prohibition 1919 to 1933. Alcohol production was shifting to industrial uses, increasing pressure on suppliers like Purity Distilling. Evidence showed that the tank had leaked regularly since its construction in 1915. Workers complained about constant drips of molasses, which often formed puddles that hardened into sticky patches on sidewalks. The company's negligence in maintaining and inspecting the tank became a central focus of the investigation. In the months following the disaster, families of the victims, injured survivors, and property owners began filing lawsuits against Purity Distilling. The company initially tried to deflect blame, claiming the flood was an unpredictable accident caused by external forces, such as temperature fluctuations or sabotage. However, testimony from engineers and workers painted a different picture. The tank was poorly designed, constructed, and maintained. City inspectors had also missed crucial signs that the tank was unsafe. The legal process became one of the earliest large-scale corporate liability cases in American history. Over 100 claims were filed, and the litigation dragged on for years. In 1925, Purity Distilling settled the claims for nearly $700,000, equivalent to over $10 million today, one of the largest settlements of the time. The case became a landmark example of corporate responsibility and regulatory oversight in urban industrial development. The Great Molasses Flood highlighted the need for stricter building codes and industrial regulations. After the disaster, cities across America began reviewing the safety of large storage tanks and industrial facilities near populated areas. Boston established new inspection protocols, mandating regular checks on tanks, structural integrity, and requiring engineering approvals for construction projects. The disaster also sparked a wider discussion about industrial expansion and public safety. It raised questions about balancing economic growth with protecting communities, especially in densely populated urban neighborhoods like Boston's North End. Despite the tragedy, the Great Molasses Flood also became part of Boston's folklore. Stories of the sticky deluge were told and retold, sometimes with a wry sense of humor, sometimes with solemn reverence. Local newspapers covered the disaster extensively, and decades later, historians, writers, and even musicians would recall the event as a symbol of industrial hubris and the unpredictable power of seemingly innocuous substances. Today, the site near the old tank is marked with a small plaque, the memory of the flood endures, reminding residents and visitors that history can surprise us in the most unexpected ways and that even the sweetest things can turn deadly. The long shadow of the sweet deluge, the Great Molasses Flood of January 15, 1919, is often remembered as one of the most unusual disasters in American history, a bizarre accident where millions of gallons of sticky syrup engulfed streets, buildings, people, and animals alike. Yet, beyond the strange spectacle and the immediate tragedy, the flood had profound and lasting impacts on Boston's development, industrial regulation, and public consciousness. In this final section, we explore the flood's enduring legacy, the changes it prompted in engineering safety, the shifts in corporate accountability it inspired, the cultural memory it embedded in the city, and the curious echoes it continues to cast more than a century later. The physical devastation wrought by the flood was staggering. Entire blocks of the North End were coated in molasses. Shops and homes suffered structural damage or total destruction. Streets had to be cleaned and repaired, and businesses faced long closures. But perhaps more remarkable was the resilience of the neighborhood. In the months and years following the disaster, the community came together to rebuild. Tenants, merchants, and local workers pooled resources and labor, restoring buildings and reopening shops. This communal recovery reinforced the North End's identity as a tight-knit immigrant neighborhood, rooted in perseverance. The disaster became a shared history, one that neighbors recounted over kitchen tables and at church gatherings, bonding the community across generations. The catastrophic failure of the molasses tank spotlighted the urgent need for better industrial oversight. In the wake of the disaster, city and state authorities enacted stricter building codes, focusing especially on large storage vessels that held volatile or heavy materials. Regulations required more rigorous engineering assessments, thorough inspections, and ongoing maintenance protocols. Engineers learned painful lessons about the importance of material quality. The tank's steel had been too thin and prone to fatigue. Construction standards, poor welding contributed to structural weaknesses. Environmental factors, expansion due to temperature shifts, had not been adequately accounted for. Safety testing, the tank was filled and put into operation before sufficient stress testing. These reforms helped prevent similar disasters elsewhere. The molasses flood became a case study in engineering schools and municipal planning discussions, a cautionary tale of what happens when speed and cost-cutting trump safety. The legal battles following the flood marked a turning point in American corporate accountability. Prior to the disaster, many companies operated with minimal oversight, often prioritizing profit over public safety. Purity Distilling's negligence, from rushed construction to ignored warnings, became emblematic of this mindset. Families of the victims and injured survivors filed lawsuits that challenged this status quo. The eventual settlement, one of the largest of its time, sent a clear message to corporations. Failure to ensure safety could result in heavy financial and reputational consequences. The case influenced later regulatory frameworks, helping establish legal principles around liability, negligence, and consumer protection. Over time, the Great Molasses Flood transcended its historical moment to enter Boston's cultural mythology. Newspapers from the period ran dramatic and sometimes sensational accounts. Artists painted the event's chaos. Poets and storytellers wove it into local lore. The flood became a symbol of industrial hubris, the fragility of human constructions, and the unexpected dangers lurking in everyday substances. Oddly, the flood's notoriety even inspired humor. Boston comedians and writers joked about the city's sweetest disaster. The phrase sticky situation gained new, literal meaning. In recent decades, the flood has been referenced in books, documentaries, and museum exhibits, preserving its story for new generations today. The Great Molasses Flood remains a vivid lesson in the complex relationship between urban life and industrial progress. The site of the tank is commemorated, and Boston's engineers, city planners, and historians reflect on the event as a reminder of vigilance and humility. In 2019, on the flood's 100th anniversary, the city held a series of lectures and public programs to honor the victims and explore the disaster's ongoing relevance. The flood also resonates with modern concerns about infrastructure, integrity, and urban disaster preparedness. In a time when cities are increasingly dependent on complex systems, the molasses flood reminds us that even small oversights in engineering or regulation can cascade into catastrophic consequences. The Great Molasses Flood is more than just an odd footnote in history. It's a story of human ambition, error, and endurance. It teaches us that progress often comes with risks, sometimes sweet, sometimes sticky, and that the consequences of negligence can ripple across communities and centuries. As you go about your day, perhaps next time you pass a construction site, a storage tank, or a city street, consider the hidden histories beneath the surface. Behind every seemingly ordinary element of urban life lies a story, sometimes of triumph, sometimes of disaster, but always of people striving to build a better world. Story 6. The Long Night. How the Great Blackout of 1965 changed New York City. Darkness falls on the city that never sleeps. You may think of New York City as a place that never sleeps, a place of constant movement, light, and noise. But on November 9, 1965, that image was shattered as the city was plunged into darkness for nearly 13 hours. The Great Northeast Blackout of 1965 was one of the most significant power outages in American history, affecting over 30 million people across the northeastern United States and parts of Canada. It turned a bright metropolis into a vast, silent shadow of itself. This story is about more than just lost electricity. It's about a city tested by sudden silence, a society's reaction when the lights go out, and the unexpected lessons learned in the dark. By the mid-1960s, New York City was a sprawling urban giant. The economy was booming, the population diverse and vibrant, and technology seemed to promise an ever brighter future. Neon signs glittered on Broadway. Subway cars rumbled with millions of commuters. Skyscrapers gleamed under floodlights. Electricity was the lifeblood of the city. Streetlights illuminated every corner. Office buildings relied on electric elevators. Hospitals depended on power for life-saving machines. Homes buzzed with radios, televisions, and kitchen appliances. The city's electrical grid was complex and interconnected, fed by a network of power plants and transmission lines stretching across states and provinces. On the morning of November 9, 1965, the city hummed with routine activity. People went to work, children attended school, and businesses prepared for the day ahead. No one suspected that within hours, the entire region would be shrouded in darkness. At the New York Power Pool, a system that coordinated power distribution among utilities, a series of small faults began cascading through the system. A protective relay at a power plant near Ontario, Canada, tripped unexpectedly. This caused a chain reaction. Power lines overloaded, transmission lines disconnected, and generators shut down in rapid succession. The failure moved southward, toward New York City, hitting key substations by 5:27 p.m. Just as the city was entering its busiest hours, the lights flickered and then went out. For many New Yorkers, the blackout was sudden and shocking. One moment the streets were bright and bustling. The next, they were plunged into darkness and silence. In office buildings, elevators halted between floors, trapping workers. Subways ground to a halt underground. Traffic lights ceased working, sending intersections into dangerous confusion. In homes, radios and televisions cut out, leaving families without their usual evening distractions. But emergency services were immediately overwhelmed. Police officers were dispatched to direct traffic manually at intersections. Fire departments prepared for possible accidents and fires, especially as many relied on electric pumps. Despite the chaos, the city's residents began to display remarkable adaptability. Candles were lit in apartments and stores. Neighbors checked on each other, offering help and reassurance. People poured into the streets, walking rather than driving, sharing stories and songs under the stars. The blackout lasted nearly 13 hours in New York City, with power gradually restored in the early hours of the next morning. During this time, the city underwent a transformation. Without electric lighting, the skyline was a silhouette against the night sky. The usual cacophony of honking cars and subway noise gave way to quieter sounds. Footsteps on pavement, distant conversations, and the occasional call of emergency sirens. Many residents reported a sense of community rarely experienced in the city's fast-paced environment. Strangers helped each other navigate dark streets, In some neighborhoods, impromptu gatherings formed where people shared food, stories, and music by flashlight or candlelight. However, not all was peaceful. Looting and vandalism occurred in some areas, particularly in parts of Brooklyn and the Bronx, as opportunistic individuals took advantage of the darkness. The blackout exposed vulnerabilities in the city's infrastructure. The power grid, designed to handle high demand, was ill-equipped to isolate faults quickly. The cascading failure demonstrated how interconnected systems can collapse when a single point falters. Emergency systems such as backup generators and communication networks were tested. Hospitals, reliant on emergency power, managed to continue critical operations, but the strain was evident. The blackout raised urgent questions about urban preparedness. How could a city of millions better protect itself from such disruptions? What measures were needed to prevent widespread chaos? As dawn broke and lights flickered back on, New Yorkers emerged from their homes, assessing damage and damage control. The blackout had ended, but its effects lingered in minds and conversations. Some saw it as a wake-up call, proof that even the most modern cities are vulnerable. Others remembered the kindness and cooperation that emerged amid the darkness. The Great Blackout of 1965 would go down as a defining moment in the city's history. A night when the city that never sleeps was forced to rest and to rethink its future. Navigating darkness, chaos, courage, and community. When the lights went out across New York City on November 9, 1965, the immediate reaction was a mixture of shock, confusion, and a primal instinct to find safety and normalcy amid the darkness. The blackout was not just an electrical failure, it was a social experiment thrust upon one of the largest urban centers in the world. How would millions of people respond when their familiar environment was stripped of its guiding lights and modern conveniences? This section explores the unfolding hours of that unforgettable night. The challenges faced, the courage shown, the fractures revealed, and the unexpected bonds forged in the city's shadows. At precisely 5:27 p.m., just as rush hour was gathering momentum, the city's electrical grid suffered a catastrophic failure. For many, the blackout came as a sudden jolt. In homes and offices, lights blinked and then went out completely. The hum of machines, the glow of televisions, and the whir of elevators all ceased. In the densely packed skyscrapers of Midtown Manhattan, the sudden pitch blackness stranded thousands on stairwells and darkened hallways. Subways, the arteries beneath the city, ground to a halt. Trains stopped mid-tunnel, leaving thousands of commuters and pitch-black cars underground. Some passengers, gripped by fear or impatience, attempted to evacuate, while others waited calmly for rescue. Traffic signals, reliant on electricity, ceased functioning immediately. Major intersections turned into dangerous crossroads filled with stalled vehicles and frantic pedestrians. Without the familiar rhythm of green and red lights, chaos loomed. Police officers were dispatched en masse, tasked with manually directing traffic, a daunting endeavor in a city with millions of vehicles. Without the electric hum, sirens, and blaring car horns, the city's soundscape shifted dramatically. The usual din gave way to a quieter, more human soundscape. Footsteps, voices, occasional laughter, and the murmurs of concern. Many New Yorkers later described the eerie stillness of the blackout as unlike anything they had ever experienced. This quiet encouraged a communal atmosphere. Neighbors who might never have spoken before found themselves together on stoops, sharing candles and stories. In apartment buildings, families gathered in hallways or lobbies, lighting candles and flashlights, checking on the elderly and children. In some neighborhoods, local musicians and singers began impromptu performances on the streets. The communal sharing of music and stories created a sense of solidarity, a reminder that even in darkness, connection persisted. Amid the confusion, countless acts of kindness and bravery unfolded. Police officers risked their safety to direct traffic in the blacked-out streets, sometimes using flares or hand signals. Firefighters remained alert for emergencies, especially the threat of fires, which were harder to detect without electricity. Hospital staff worked around the clock under emergency power, ensuring that critical patients, especially newborns, surgical cases, and those on respirators were cared for despite power interruptions. Many residents took it upon themselves to help strangers. Some lent flashlights or candles to neighbors. Others offered rides to those stranded by the halted subways. Community centers opened their doors as warming stations, providing a safe haven for those vulnerable to the cold November night. In stories that became part of local legend, Neighbors helped the elderly navigate dark stairwells, families shared food, and even strangers exchanged smiles and reassurance. The blackout, though disruptive, briefly dissolved the anonymity typical of urban life. However, the blackout also revealed underlying social tensions and inequalities. In several neighborhoods, particularly in parts of Brooklyn and the Bronx, incidents of looting and vandalism were reported. Opportunistic criminals exploited the darkness and the reduced police presence to break into stores and homes. The unrest was not widespread, but it was significant enough to prompt increased police patrols and emergency response. Observers noted that areas hardest hit by crime during the blackout often correlated with economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, revealing fractures in the city's social fabric. The city's emergency response faced criticism for being slow to address these incidents, highlighting challenges in coordinating large-scale crisis management in a metropolis as complex as New York. The subway system, the lifeline for millions of New Yorkers, was brought to a near standstill. Approximately 800 trains stopped running. Thousands of passengers were trapped in dark tunnels or on stalled trains. The transit authority scrambled to evacuate stranded riders, often using flashlights and manual signals. The blackout forced workers to switch to emergency protocols, opening emergency exits and guiding passengers to safety. Many commuters spent hours underground, unsure when they would be freed. The outage revealed vulnerabilities in the transit system's reliance on centralized electric power and underscored the need for backup power systems and improved emergency procedures. Communication also suffered greatly. Telephones, many of which relied on electric power or manual switchboards, were overwhelmed. Radio stations faced outages or limited broadcasting capability. The lack of reliable communication made coordinating emergency services and disseminating information to the public challenging. Some radio stations continued broadcasting on emergency power, becoming vital sources of news and guidance. New Yorkers crowded around radios to receive updates and instructions. The blackout illuminated the fragility of urban communication networks and sparked plans to improve emergency broadcast capabilities and public communication during crises. The blackout struck at a crucial time of day, early evening, just as many businesses were finishing operations or restaurants were preparing for dinner service. Many businesses closed early or lost a day's work entirely. Restaurants and theaters canceled performances. Stock exchanges and financial institutions, dependent on electronic data, halted trading. The city's economy suffered an estimated loss of millions of dollars, highlighting the economic risks of infrastructure failures in a modern metropolis. Despite the challenges, New Yorkers showed remarkable resilience. The blackout became a moment of shared experience, a pause in the city's relentless pace. People helped one another, improvised solutions, and kept calm under pressure. The event exposed weaknesses, but also demonstrated the strength of community spirit and civic pride. By the time power was restored the next morning, many New Yorkers had endured an unexpected night of uncertainty and connection. The blackout prompted widespread reflection on urban vulnerability, the need for infrastructure improvements, and the social disparities that crises can expose. In the years that followed, city officials, engineers, and policymakers worked to strengthen the electrical grid, enhance emergency preparedness, and improve communication systems. Lessons illuminated aftermath and transformation. As dawn broke over a still-darkened New York City on November 10, 1965, the long night of the Great Blackout was finally coming to an end. Slowly, the lights flickered back to life. Street traffic signals, apartment windows, and office towers. But the blackout had done more than interrupt daily routines. It had exposed vulnerabilities in the city's infrastructure, revealed societal fractures, and ignited a transformation in urban planning, emergency preparedness, and community relations. This final section explores how the blackout shaped New York's future and left an enduring mark on urban history. The restoration of electricity was neither immediate nor uniform. Power companies worked tirelessly through the night and early morning, rerouting electricity and repairing damaged lines. By mid-morning on November 10th, power was mostly restored in Manhattan, though some neighborhoods in Queens, the Bronx, and Brooklyn remained dark for several more hours. For many New Yorkers, the first light of electricity was a profound relief. The return of streetlights meant safer travel. Traffic signals reduced chaos at intersections. Elevators resumed their upward and downward shuttling, sparing many from grueling stair climbs. businesses cautiously reopened, assessing damage and preparing to resume operations. Subways resumed full service, restoring the city's vital circulatory system. The blackout's physical damage was relatively limited compared to other disasters, but the economic impact was significant. Estimates at the time placed economic losses at $80 million, equivalent to roughly $700 million today. This figure included lost productivity, spoiled food, business interruptions, and repair costs. The psychological toll was also considerable. Millions of residents had endured hours of uncertainty and, for some, fear. The city's sense of security was shaken. City officials, engineers, and utility companies faced intense pressure to ensure such a disaster would never occur. The blackout had highlighted how vulnerable the electrical grid was to cascading failures. The complex interconnection between power plants, substations, and transmission lines, designed to improve efficiency, also meant that a single failure could propagate rapidly. The New York Power, Pool, and regional grid operators undertook comprehensive reviews. New safety measures included improved protective relays to detect faults faster and isolate them before they cascaded, redundancy enhancements, building multiple pathways for electricity to flow so that the failure of one line would not cripple the system, regular inspections and maintenance, ensuring equipment was in peak condition. Emergency power supplies, upgrading backup generators in critical facilities such as hospitals and transit hubs. These technical upgrades took years to implement, but significantly increased the reliability of New York's electrical system. The blackout also exposed gaps in emergency management. The manual traffic control by police officers, though heroic, was insufficient for a city of millions. The lack of effective communication between agencies hindered coordinated response. In response, New York City developed and expanded emergency operations centers to better coordinate multi-agency efforts during crises. They invested in radio communications systems for police, fire, and medical services to maintain contact even when traditional networks failed. The blackout also spurred improvements in public alert systems. Authorities recognized the need for timely, accurate information to prevent panic and misinformation. Regular drills and training exercises became standard, preparing responders and the public for a range of emergency scenarios. One of the most striking legacies of the blackout was the social reflection it prompted. On one hand, the event had demonstrated the remarkable resilience and generosity of New Yorkers. Stories of neighbors helping neighbors, communities gathering in shared spaces, and strangers lending aid became part of the city's lore. On the other hand, the incidents of looting and disorder in poorer neighborhoods revealed deep-seated social inequalities. The blackout underscored how vulnerable marginalized communities were to both the direct effects of disasters and the consequences of weakened social order. In the following years, policymakers increasingly acknowledged that emergency preparedness must address not just infrastructure but social equity, ensuring all neighborhoods receive resources and support. The blackout quickly became a cultural touchstone. Newspapers recounted vivid eyewitness stories. Photographers captured haunting images of the city in darkness. Television documentaries later revisited the event as a cautionary tale. The blackout was referenced in literature and art as a metaphor for sudden change, vulnerability, and the duality of chaos and community. Museums and local historians preserve artifacts and testimonies, ensuring that new generations understand the event's significance. The 1965 blackout set a precedent for managing urban electrical failures. In 2003, a much larger blackout struck the northeastern US and Canada, affecting 50 million people. Many lessons from 1965 influenced the response, including emergency communication strategies and infrastructure resilience efforts. Today, as cities face challenges from climate change, cyber attacks, and aging infrastructure, the story of the 1965 blackout remains relevant. It reminds us that modern conveniences depend on complex systems vulnerable to failure, and that social cohesion and preparedness are vital to weathering crises. The Great Blackout of 1965 was more than a power outage. It was a mirror reflecting New York City's strengths and weaknesses. It tested the city's nerves, infrastructure, and social fabric. In its darkness, it illuminated the importance of preparation, the power of community, and the need for continual investment in public safety. For a city famous for its unyielding energy, the blackout was a humbling reminder. Even the brightest lights can be extinguished, but the human spirit can shine through the darkest nights. Story 7: The Forgotten Siege. How the Siege of Kut changed the British Empire, the quiet beginning of a forgotten siege. You might not have heard of Kut, a small town along the Tigris River in what is today Iraq, but in the early years of World War I, it became the center of a dramatic and grueling siege that tested the limits of empire, endurance, and military strategy. The Siege of Kut, lasting from December 1915 to April 1916, was one of the longest sieges in modern warfare and marked a rare and significant defeat for British forces during the Great War. This story isn't about grand battles or famous generals. It's about the slow, grinding attrition of siege warfare, the harsh realities of life under blockade, and how a relatively obscure episode revealed cracks in British imperial ambition and altered the course of Middle Eastern history. War I erupted in 1914. The British Empire, stretched across continents, faced enemies not just in Europe, but in distant lands like the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, allied with Germany, controlled vast territories including modern-day Iraq. The British Indian Army, tasked with protecting imperial interests and securing oil supplies near the Persian Gulf, launched an offensive into Mesopotamia, now Iraq. The goal was to push northward along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, seizing key cities and securing control. Initial advances were swift. British forces captured Basra in late 1914 and moved steadily up. However, as the campaign progressed, logistical difficulties, harsh climate, and fierce Ottoman resistance complicated matters. Kut-al-Amara, or Kut, was a small town on the banks of the Tigris River, located about 100 miles southeast of Baghdad. Strategically, Kut was important as a river port and supply hub controlling access to the upper reaches of the Tigris. In November 1915, under the command of Major General Charles Townshend, a British force of around 11,000 soldiers advanced to Kut after earlier victories. Instead of pushing onward toward Baghdad, Townshend made a critical decision. He halted and fortified Kut, establishing a defensive perimeter. This decision would have profound consequences. By mid-December 1915, Ottoman forces under the command of Khalil Pasha surrounded Kut, cutting off all land and river supply lines. The British garrison was effectively trapped. The siege began quietly. Kut was fortified with trenches and barbed wire, and the British attempted to hold the perimeter. Food and ammunition supplies were limited, and the hot Mesopotamian winter offered little relief from harsh conditions. Communication with British headquarters was sporadic, complicating efforts to coordinate relief. For the soldiers and officers inside Kut, life soon became a test of endurance and survival. Food supplies dwindled rapidly. Initially, rations were reduced and meals became meager. As weeks passed, starvation loomed. Water quality became a problem as the Tigris's flow was affected by the siege. Sanitation deteriorated, and diseases such as cholera and dysentery spread. The relentless heat of the region, combined with inadequate shelter, added to suffering. Medical supplies were scarce, and wounded soldiers struggled to receive adequate care. Despite these hardships, the garrison maintained discipline and morale, buoyed by hope that relief forces would arrive. Outside Kut, British commanders mounted multiple attempts to relieve the trapped garrison. Several relief expeditions advanced upriver, engaging Ottoman forces in a series of battles. However, the Ottoman defenders were well prepared, and British relief efforts stalled repeatedly. Failed attempts drained resources and morale. Each defeat deepened the isolation of Kut's defenders. The siege was not just a military event, but a test of British imperial resolve in a region distant from Europe's main battlefields. British policymakers and military leaders grappled with competing priorities: the need to maintain prestige, protect resources, and avoid further entanglement in a difficult campaign. The failure to break the siege exposed weaknesses in planning, logistics, and understanding of the region. As winter gave way to spring, the siege tightened its grip. Inside Kut, conditions deteriorated sharply. Starvation became severe. Soldiers scavenged for food, some resorting to eating rats and even leather. Disease claimed many lives. Outside, British command debated strategy, weighing the costs of further offensives against the desire to rescue the garrison. The siege's slow grind became a war of attrition, with no clear end in sight. As the siege dragged on, a haunting question loomed over Kut's defenders and British leaders alike. Could relief forces break the Ottoman encirclement, or was the garrison doomed to a slow, grim fate? Struggle and desperation inside the walls of Kut, as the cold winter of 1915 gave way to the harsh Mesopotamian spring. The siege at Kut-al-Amara deepened. For the approximately 11,000 British and Indian soldiers trapped inside, the days stretched into weeks and months, each one testing their endurance and will to survive. The initial hope of a swift relief faded as supply lines remained cut, and the Ottoman grip tightened like a noose. This section explores the grim realities inside the besieged town. The deteriorating conditions, the psychological toll, the desperate attempts at survival, and the military maneuvers that defined one of the longest sieges of the First World War. Kut, once a modest but functioning river town, had transformed into a fortress under siege, its walls encircled by Ottoman troops. General Townshend and his officers worked tirelessly to maintain order and morale, but the strain of confinement was palpable. The soldiers lived in trenches and makeshift shelters, exposed to the extremes of Mesopotamian weather, blistering heat during the day, chilling cold at night. Rain turned the earth into sticky mud, and the Tigris River, the town's lifeline, offered little relief as it became muddied and unreliable for drinking water. Communication with British command was limited to unreliable runners and makeshift radio transmissions offering scant news or encouragement. The psychological weight of being cut off, with enemy lines only yards away, pressed heavily on everyone. One of the most devastating aspects of the siege was the scarcity of food. Kut's defenders began with modest stocks of provisions, but these were quickly consumed. Early in the siege, rationing reduced daily food allowances. Meals became smaller and less nutritious. As the siege dragged on, starvation set in. Soldiers scavenged for anything edible, discarded horse meat, rodents, and in some cases, leather. From boots, malnutrition weakens men, making them susceptible to disease. The British supply chain's failure to deliver food only deepened the crisis. Attempts to run supplies up the river were thwarted by Ottoman gunfire and logistical challenges. Beyond hunger, disease ravaged the garrison. Dysentery, cholera, and malaria spread rapidly in the unsanitary crowded conditions. Medical supplies were in short supply, and the field hospital was overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses worked under impossible circumstances, struggling to treat the sick and wounded with limited equipment. Many suffered silently, isolated from their comrades. Deaths mounted, but burial space was limited. The dead were often buried hurriedly, sometimes in mass graves, deepening the grim atmosphere. Despite the dire conditions, the soldiers and officers of Kut demonstrated remarkable resilience. Discipline was maintained through strict routines and military order. Townshend's leadership, though later criticized, played a role in organizing defenses and keeping hope alive. Religious services were held to bolster morale. Letters from home, when they arrived, were treasured lifelines. Stories from survivors speak of camaraderie and sacrifice of men sharing meager rations, helping wounded comrades, and keeping spirits high through music, storytelling, and humor. Outside the walls, Ottoman forces under Khalil Pasha maintained a tight blockade. Aware of Kut's weakening state, they reinforced their positions, dug extensive trenches, and established artillery batteries that could shell the town. Ottoman soldiers faced their own hardships, including extreme heat and supply issues, but they were determined to hold their ground. The siege became a war of attrition, a battle of wills and endurance on both sides. Back in British command, multiple attempts were made to break the siege. Relief columns, comprising fresh troops and heavy artillery, launched offensive in early 1916. Battles at Hana, Falahir, and Sanayat tested Ottoman defenses. However, the relief forces repeatedly suffered heavy casualties and logistical failures. The terrain was difficult, with marshes and rivers complicating movement. Ottoman forces were well entrenched and prepared. These setbacks frustrated commanders and dampened morale among troops inside Kut, who desperately awaited rescue. As the siege dragged on, criticism grew. Some British officers questioned Townshend's decision to hold Kut rather than retreat earlier to a more defensible position. Debate raged over whether reinforcements and supplies were sufficient or timely. Political pressures and the desire to maintain imperial prestige complicated strategic choices. Though soldiers bore the brunt of the siege, civilians, local workers, camp followers, and families also suffered. Many had fled to Kut seeking safety but were trapped by the blockade. Food and water shortages affected them severely. Disease and death among non-combatants added another layer of tragedy. By spring 1916, the situation inside Kut was desperate. Starvation was acute. Disease rampant. Relief seemed increasingly unlikely. The garrison faced the haunting prospect of surrender or annihilation. The resilience of the men was extraordinary. But human limits were approaching. As the siege entered its 5th month, the haunting question persisted: could the British forces break the siege and save Kut, or would the town fall, marking a rare and costly defeat for the British Empire? The fall of Kut and its lasting legacy. After nearly 5 months under siege, the situation at Kut had become desperate beyond measure. Starvation, disease, and dwindling hope wore down the defenders' bodies and spirits. Outside the fortified town, the British Empire faced a harsh reckoning, one that would leave scars on military strategy, imperial pride, and Middle Eastern geopolitics for decades. This final section recounts the dramatic surrender of Kut, the ordeal of captivity that followed, and the profound consequences that shaped the future of British involvement in the region. By late April 1916, the garrison's condition was catastrophic. Rations had dwindled to almost nothing, soldiers were emaciated, and the death toll from disease and starvation mounted daily. General Townshend, under immense pressure from his officers and the suffering troops, faced an agonizing choice: continue to hold out with diminishing hope of relief, or surrender to save the remaining lives. Despite fierce resistance among some ranks who preferred to fight to the death, Townshend made the painful decision to capitulate. On April 29, 1916, the British forces at Kut officially surrendered to the Ottoman army. Approximately 13,000 men, including wounded soldiers and officers, became prisoners of war. The surrender was a devastating blow to British morale and prestige. Kut represented one of the greatest defeats for the British Empire during World War I. The loss of an entire division's worth of troops without achieving their objective was a rare failure amid a war often marked by British victories. The Ottomans celebrated the victory as a major triumph, boosting morale and propaganda. It was one of the few times during the war that Ottoman forces decisively defeated a Western power in open combat. The captured soldiers faced a harsh and brutal captivity. The Ottoman captors transported many prisoners over hundreds of miles to camps in Anatolia, enduring grueling marches known as the Death Marches. Prisoners suffered from malnutrition, disease, exposure to harsh climates, and mistreatment. Thousands perished before the war's end. Those who survived captivity returned home physically and psychologically scarred. The siege of Kut forced the British military and government to reconsider their Middle Eastern strategy. Criticism of command decisions, logistical failures, and underestimation of Ottoman strength prompted reforms. The British command eventually appointed new leadership and reorganized their forces for a renewed offensive. The siege underscored the difficulty of waging war in harsh and unfamiliar terrain with stretched supply lines. News of the defeat at Kut shocked the British public and media. The empire, accustomed to victories and colonial dominance, faced the uncomfortable reality of a costly and humiliating setback. Political leaders in London faced pressure to justify the campaign and improve conditions for troops. The defeat contributed to a broader reassessment of imperial ambitions in the Middle East. Beyond military history, the siege influenced the future of the region. The British later succeeded in capturing Baghdad in 1917, but the prolonged conflict highlighted the challenges of controlling Mesopotamia. The war and its aftermath paved the way for British mandate rule over Iraq, shaping the political landscape for decades. Local populations, many of whom endured hardship during the war, experienced the deep and lasting effects of foreign intervention. The Siege of Kut remains a powerful lesson in military strategy and human endurance. It illustrates the perils of overextension, the critical importance of logistics, and the human cost of warfare. The siege is often overshadowed by larger battles of World War I, but its story reveals the complexity and global reach of the conflict. The resilience of the soldiers, the suffering endured, and the eventual outcome offer sobering reflections on the costs of empire today. Kut is largely a footnote in the grand narratives of the First World War, yet, for those who lived through it and their descendants, the siege is a profound chapter of sacrifice and survival. Its story invites us to remember the less glamorous, often overlooked episodes of history that nonetheless shaped nations and peoples. As you reflect on this siege, consider the countless human stories intertwined with the vast sweep of empire and war, stories of endurance, loss, and the fragile nature of power.